There are great similarities between humans and sheep. We may not have wool on our backs or emit baaing sounds, but we often have an urge to follow our fellow creatures passively and have a horror of breaking away from the group. Why do we follow sheepishly behind other people, particularly important other people? Largely because we imagine they must know what they're talking about, and so we trot along behind them. The reason why there are a lot of woolly or at least imprecise ideas out there in the world is that many people imagine that you can come up with a good idea without thinking too hard about it. Socrates thought this was crazy, and to bring out the insanity of this position, compared thinking to potting. And no one would imagine that you could make a good pot without at least following some pretty rigorous steps. And yet many people imagine that you could come up with a good ethical idea, an idea on how to live your life, without thinking too hard about it. Socrates went further in his analogy. He actually came up with a distinct method, a Socratic method of thought. He identified 5 distinct steps which anyone who wanted to come up with a good thought would have to follow in order to do so. And these thoughts can roughly be summarized as follows. Firstly, look around you for statements that many people would describe as plain common sense. For example, that the best jobs are those which are most highly paid, or that happiness comes from being married. Secondly, try and find an exception to this. Could you ever be married and yet unhappy? Or could you ever be in a very well-paid job and yet miserable? Thirdly, if an exception to this statement is found, it must mean that your statement is false or at least imprecise. And in this case, we find that there is an imprecision. Fourthly, try to nuance the initial statement to take the exception into account. So in our example, realize that it is possible to be quite unhappy in a very highly paid job if it's completely creatively unfulfilling, or to be quite miserable in a marriage if you've married the wrong person. Lastly, you continue this process for as long as possible. You keep trying to find exceptions to your common sense statement. And Socrates said that the truth, insofar as anyone's ever able to reach the truth, lies in a statement which it seems impossible to disprove. If we test our opinions in this way, Socrates believed, we'll be able to construct trustworthy and watertight thoughts, in just the same way as a skilled potter makes trustworthy and watertight pots. The point of Socrates' method is that it makes you far less passive, less inclined to follow the other sheep. If other people disagree, we don't just have to say, limply or petulantly, well, I think I'm right, but I can't tell you why. We'll be able to demonstrate logically why we believe things, and if others ignore the logic, then their opposition won't have to unnerve us so badly. Most of us imagine that we can't be philosophers because we haven't studied philosophy, we haven't read enough, we haven't gone to school long enough, we haven't done a university degree. And I think what I find extremely inspiring in Socrates is the idea that everyone can think. And not just everyone can think, but everyone has a responsibility to think. As he famously put it, the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates made the idea of an examined life seem far from forbidding. Socrates suggests that we can have an interesting philosophical conversation anywhere, even on a street corner. Philosophy needn't just happen behind the walls of a university or in a schoolroom. Socrates used to talk to an extraordinary range of people and liked to demonstrate to them that they were all able to arrive at well-thought-out opinions. It's an inspiring idea. However, in our modern democratic societies, where focus groups and opinion pollsters rule, Socrates would have thought that our problem is that we tend to listen to opinions whether they're well thought out or not.
There's too much risk involved with that.
Although Socrates believed that we were all, in theory, capable of living an examined life, he knew that in practice most of us don't. And this meant that he couldn't accept that every opinion was equally worth listening to, any more than that every pot was equally capable of holding water. Strange as it may sound to modern ears, and even though he lived in the very cradle of democracy, Socrates had the gravest reservations about democracy, because he refused to accept that just because the majority supported an opinion, that made it right. And he'd have thought it ridiculous that people in positions of power might be guided by focus groups like this. Most important decisions in ancient Athens were taken according to the will of the majority. Once a month, the whole citizen body would be asked to gather at the foot of the Acropolis and talk about all the important issues facing Athens. And we find exactly the same approach going on today in modern government and business. Polling organisations, rather like this one, gather groups of people and ask them what they think, and then important decisions are taken according to the will of the majority. I think Socrates would have disagreed violently with what's going on in there. He would have objected not just to the decor, I think, but also to the whole approach, which is that the will of the majority should decide an issue. In his eyes, what matters is whether an argument is logical, is reasonable. That's the way that we should make decisions, not according to the will of the majority. The one fact that people tend to remember about Socrates is that he faced a trial and that he was condemned to death. This has remained a very potent image, so that if you walk around the streets of Athens today, you can still see the scene represented all over the place. And that's because it has become an immensely powerful symbol of someone standing up courageously and intelligently against the will of the majority. The charge against Socrates was of having corrupted the youth of Athens and of failing to respect the gods the city worshipped. The potential penalty was death. One March morning, Socrates was asked to show up at the courthouse in Athens, and Socrates was facing probably a jury of 500 Athenian citizens. And what we do know is that the atmosphere inside the courtroom was relatively hostile towards Socrates from the very beginning. They were suspicious of this man. Many of them had been questioned by him before, and they were not on his side. So Socrates was really facing the possibility that he would die, and yet he didn't lose his nerve. And Socrates said, if I was allowed more time to make my case to you, dear Athenians, I'm sure I could convince you of the justice of my cause, but I can't. And he accepted this very fatalistically. When the final vote came to be taken, the majority of the jury decided that he was guilty and that he should be sent to death. Socrates was led off from the courtroom to the prison just a few yards away. His wife, Xanthippe, came to visit him, but she broke down so hysterically that she had to be led away. Many of his friends were also in tears. Even the prison warder, who had seen many go to their deaths, offered his apologies and said that of all the people who had ever come through the jail, Socrates was the noblest, the most generous, and the wisest. And a few moments later, the executioner came through the door with a cup of hemlock. Socrates was given the cup and asked to drink. And after a few moments, his legs began to feel heavy. Slowly, the paralysis caused by the conine, the paralyzing agent in hemlock, started working through his body. And within a few minutes, his whole body was paralyzed, and his friend Fido reached forward and shut his eyes. Of course, very few of us will be called upon to die for our beliefs. But Socrates makes us see that we all have the capacity, and indeed the duty, to stop following opinions passively, and instead to develop beliefs we can truly have confidence in. Though we're often reluctant to see it, all of us can make the transition from being a sheep to being a thinking person, that is, a philosopher.